Let's look at some of the factions competing for power in Iran and how they have exerted or failed to exert their influence through governmental institutions over recent years. Clerical conservatives, like the supreme leader and his allies, are determined to keep Iran a Shia Islam nation. They oppose any increased ties with Western Europe and even more with the United States. They fear ties like that, any connection with the Western world, may weaken their authority. Democratic reformers, sometimes called the Green Wave or Green Revolution in Iran, as mentioned before, are probably the most popular faction, but to a large extent have been kept out of official positions. That doesn't mean they're without influence. Ayatollah Khamenei has repressed the movement, but must also take into account some of its demands, lest the pressure become too great and cause a complete transformation in Iranian politics, a new revolution. Ironically, the greatest impact of the pro-reform green movement, this radical movement, may be to frighten Khamenei into allowing more political space for the pragmatic centrist reformers who want some economic reforms which don't, at least directly, challenge the foundations of the regime. Also, giving these pragmatic moderates political space is the fact that Iran desperately needs economic relief from Western sanctions and an infusion of Western cash. In 2013, moderates in the Iranian government reached out and began negotiations with Europe and the United States, attempting to forge an agreement where Iran would cease production on nuclear weapons and would receive relief from sanctions in return. What was the Iranian political situation at this time? After the 2013 elections, conservative clerics held a majority in most of the government. But a moderate reformer, a pragmatist, Hassan Rouhani, did win election as president. It was President Rouhani and his ministers who reached out to the United States and Europe, and it was President Rouhani and his pragmatists who concluded the anti-nuclear deal. The hope of Rouhani and other pragmatists was that the sanction relief would both in and of itself improve Iran's economic conditions and additionally would open the door for investment in Iran from the United States and Europe. The fear of Ali Khamenei and other clerical conservatives, and the hope of many in the West and many people in Iran, was that if the treaty was a success and the country became more integrated with other Western democracies, it might strengthen the hands of the reformers and lead to more radical change. The opposite has occurred. In the last 3 years, Iran has moved sharply to the right. Given that candidate Trump made no secret of his hatred for the deal, American sources often see Trump's rhetoric as the source of the move back to clerical conservatism in Iran. There's no doubt that that was a factor, but it's very difficult to figure exactly how big a factor. Internal Iranian politics played a large role as well. But since these internal disputes played out in the context of U.S. actions, it's almost impossible to disentangle the two. In the lead up to the 2016 Iranian elections, at a point when Trump's views were known, but when most expected Trump to lose, the Guardian Council banned almost half of the candidates who sought to run for parliament, including many reformist candidates, including all of the most well-known. Presumably, upon the orders of the Supreme Leader, the Guardian Council directed security forces to arrest not only protesters, but even reformist candidates. There's no doubt that Trump's rhetoric made it easier for Khamenei and his hardline allies to demonize the United States. Rouhani, elected as a moderate in 2017, chose ministers that were more conservative than was expected, and he even backtracked on some of his campaign promises, not appointing a woman minister, for example. To what degree was this because Rouhani was never a sincere reformist? To what degree was it because he feared the wrath of the Supreme Leader? To what degree did the rhetoric coming from the United States, which Rouhani may have realized was going to put the hardliners back in the driver's seat, to what degree each of these may have played a part, it's almost impossible to say. A wave of protests broke out and began spreading through Iran in 2017. They started with economic demands, but the demands expanded into a complete renunciation of an Islamic state, the elimination of the position of supreme leader, a secular democracy. Protests put moderates like Rouhani in a position where they had to choose. Were they going to support these protests and try to ride them into true reform in Iran, but at the same time risk the wrath of the supreme leader if they failed? Or would they denounce the protesters, allowing and facilitating a step to the right in Iran? Remember that these were moderates in power. The true reformers had generally been banned from running for office. When the protesters began chanting "Death to Khamenei," the moderates' decision was made for them. Rouhani and those around him came out and denounced the protesters. Is there hope for a freer, more democratic Iran in the future? We can take that up in the discussion forums.